The smell of diesel fuel and hydraulic fluid hit my nostrils as I watched 3 massive bulldozers roll onto my property at 6 a.m. sharp. The lead operator, a burly man named Jake, who I'd known for 15 years, stepped out of his cab and walked toward me with his hard hat in hand, his face twisted with confusion and guilt. "Tommy," he said, his voice barely audible over the rumbling engines. "I'm real sorry about this, but we got orders to demolish that old barn of yours. The HOA sent us paperwork saying it's a safety hazard and needs to come down today." I stood there in my pajamas and boots, coffee mug still steaming in my hand, watching as Karen Pemberton emerged from her pristine white Escalade like some kind of suburban warlord. She was clutching a manila folder thick with documents, her perfectly manicured finger already pointing toward my great-grandfather's century-old barn. "Mr. Rodriguez," she called out in that shrill voice that had become the soundtrack to my nightmares, "you've had plenty of notice. That eyesore is coming down whether you cooperate or not." What Karen didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have known, was that I owned the demolition company she'd hired to destroy my own property. But let me back up 6 months, because this story starts with something much smaller, a mailbox. I'd lived on Willow Creek Ranch for 3 years, ever since my grandfather passed and left me the 40-acre spread on the outskirts of what used to be rural Texas. The property had been in our family since 1924, complete with the original farmhouse, a magnificent red oak barn, and enough pasture to run a small cattle operation. The trouble began when Meadowbrook Estates started construction on the adjacent land. What had once been rolling hills and mesquite trees suddenly became a maze of cookie-cutter McMansions, perfectly manicured lawns, and HOA-approved mailboxes that looked like they'd been ordered from the same catalog. My mailbox, on the other hand, was a weathered wooden post with a rusty metal box that my grandfather had installed sometime in the 1960s. It had character, history, and most importantly, it was on my own damn property. Karen Pemberton moved into the biggest house in Meadowbrook Estates and immediately got herself elected as HOA president. Within 2 weeks, I found my first violation notice tucked into that rusty mailbox. Property owner must replace non-conforming mailbox structure within 30 days to maintain neighborhood aesthetic standards. It read in that cold, bureaucratic language that would soon become all too familiar. I crumpled up the notice and tossed it in the trash. My property wasn't part of their HOA, and they had no jurisdiction over my mailbox, my barn, or anything else on my land. Or so I thought. The second notice arrived with a photograph of my mailbox attached, along with a formal demand for $500 in non-compliance fees. This time, I decided to drive over to Karen's house and have a conversation like civilized adults. Karen answered the door in a pink velour tracksuit, her blonde hair pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch her face into a permanent expression of disapproval. Behind her, I could see an immaculate living room that looked like it had never been lived in. "Mrs. Pemberton," I started, trying to keep my voice friendly, "I think there's been some confusion about my mailbox. My property isn't part of your HOA, so—" "Actually, Mr. Rodriguez," she interrupted, pulling out a thick folder from a side table, "according to our legal research, your property does fall under our jurisdiction. The previous landowner signed an agreement in 1998 that binds all future owners to our aesthetic standards." She handed me a photocopy of a document I'd never seen before. The signature at the bottom looked nothing like my grandfather's handwriting, but the legal jargon was dense enough to make my head spin. "This has to be some kind of mistake," I said, studying the paper. "My grandfather would never have agreed to this." Karen's smile was sharp as a razor blade. "Mistakes or not, it's legally binding. You have 2 weeks to replace that mailbox, or will be forced to take further action." The way she said further action made my blood run cold, but I wasn't about to back down from some suburban dictator with too much time on her hands. I spent the next week researching property law and discovered that Karen was technically correct about one thing. There was indeed a document on file with the county clerk's office. But the more I dug into it, the more suspicious it became. The signature was forged, I was sure of it. My grandfather's real signature was on dozens of documents in my possession, and this one didn't match. The date coincided with a period when he was recovering from a stroke and rarely left his property. And most damning of all, the document had been notarized by someone who, according to public records, had moved out of state 2 months before the supposed signing date. But proving forgery in court would cost more money than I had, and Karen knew it. The mailbox was just the beginning. Over the next month, violation notices started arriving weekly. My barn was structurally unsound and aesthetically non-compliant. My fence needed to be upgraded to HOA-approved materials. Even my pickup truck was supposedly in violation because it was commercial grade and parked in view of the street. Each notice came with increasing fines and increasingly threatening language about legal remedies and forced compliance measures. I tried ignoring them, thinking they'd eventually give up and move on to harassing someone else. That was my first mistake. The second mistake was underestimating just how far Karen Pemberton was willing to go to get her way. I was out checking my cattle one morning when I heard the sound of heavy machinery coming up my driveway. A massive tow truck was backing up to my pickup, and Karen was standing beside it with a clipboard and that same predatory smile. "Morning, Tommy," she called out cheerfully, as if she wasn't in the process of stealing my truck. "We're repossessing your vehicle for unpaid HOA violations. Total amount due is $7,850. The tow truck driver, a thin man with nervous eyes, started hooking up my Ford. "Sorry, buddy," he muttered without looking at me. "Lady says she's got legal authority." "Legal authority?" I exploded. "This is theft. You can't just—" "Actually," Karen interrupted, consulting her clipboard, "under the enforcement provisions of the HOA agreement, we absolutely can. Your grandfather signed away those rights when he agreed to be bound by our covenants." I watched helplessly as they drove away with my truck, leaving me stranded on my own property with nothing but a receipt for impounded property and a burning rage that threatened to consume everything in its path. That night, I called my cousin Miguel, who worked as a paralegal in Houston. After I explained the situation, he was quiet for a long moment. "Tommy," he finally said, "what you're describing sounds like systematic harassment designed to force you off your land. Have you considered that maybe they want your property for something?" The pieces started clicking together. My 40 acres sat right in the middle of what would otherwise be a perfect planned community. With my ranch gone, they could expand Meadowbrook Estates, add another 100 homes, and make millions in the process. I started paying closer attention to the Meadowbrook Estates marketing materials and discovered something interesting. Their master development plan showed my property as future community expansion with a completion date of next year. They weren't just harassing me for fun. They were trying to force me to sell. But I had a few surprises of my own. The first thing Karen didn't know about me was that I'd spent 8 years in the Army Corps of Engineers before coming home to run the ranch. I knew construction, demolition, and heavy equipment better than most people knew their own backyard. The second thing she didn't know was that I'd used my GI Bill benefits and my inheritance to start Rodriguez Demolition Services 3 years ago. It was a small operation, just me and 4 employees, but we specialized in residential and commercial demolition throughout the county. The third thing she didn't know was that Miguel's paralegal job was just his side gig. His main occupation was as an investigative journalist who specialized in exposing municipal corruption. And the fourth thing, the thing that would ultimately destroy her, was that her own husband was having an affair with the Meadowbrook Estate sales director, and they'd been systematically overcharging homeowners and skimming money from the HOA budget for the past 2 years. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The harassment campaign escalated over the next few weeks. They filed noise complaints against my cattle, claiming the mooing violated quiet enjoyment standards. They reported me to the county for improper agricultural use in a residential zone, even though my property had been zoned agricultural for decades before their subdivision existed. Most infuriatingly, they somehow got a court order requiring me to remove my barn within 90 days, claiming it posed a significant safety hazard to the surrounding community. I knew the barn was solid as a rock. My great-grandfather had built it to last, using techniques and materials that would outlive anything in Karen's plastic subdivision. But the county inspector who'd condemned it was Karen's brother-in-law, and the fix was clearly in. That's when I decided it was time to fight fire with fire. Miguel started his investigation by requesting public records for all of Meadowbrook Estate's financial documents. What he found was a paper trail of corruption that went back to the very beginning of the development. The original land purchase had been financed through a shell company owned by Karen's husband, Robert. The construction contracts had been awarded to companies that, upon closer inspection, were also controlled by the Pemberton family. And the HOA budget showed enormous expenditures for landscape maintenance and security services that seemed to correlate suspiciously with large deposits into the Pembertons' personal accounts. But the smoking gun was the affair. Robert Pemberton and Sarah Mitchell, the Meadowbrook Estate's sales director, had been using HOA funds to pay for weekend trips to Dallas, expensive dinners, and even a timeshare in Cabo that was listed under one of their shell companies. While Miguel was building our case, I was preparing for the demolition order. Karen had hired Apex Demolition Services to tear down my barn, and the work was scheduled for the following Monday. What she didn't realize was that I'd bought Apex Demolition Services 6 months earlier. The previous owner, an older gentleman named Frank Morrison, had been looking to retire and sell the business. When I approached him about purchasing it, he was thrilled to pass it on to someone who understood the industry. The paperwork had gone through just after New Year's, making Rodriguez Demolition Services the parent company of Apex. Karen had literally hired me to destroy my own property. I spent the weekend preparing for what was going to be the most satisfying Monday morning of my life. Jake Martinez, my foreman and the lead operator she'd seen that morning, was in on the plan from the beginning. His job was to make everything look legitimate until Karen revealed just how far she was willing to go. "You sure about this, boss?" Jake had asked me the night before. "This lady seems like the type to sue first and ask questions later." "Trust me," I told him. "By the time this is over, she's going to have much bigger problems than my barn." So there we were at 6 a.m. with Karen standing in my driveway, thinking she was about to watch my family's century-old barn get reduced to rubble. "Well," she demanded, looking from me to Jake and back again. "What are you waiting for? I want that eyesore gone before noon." Jake looked at me, and I gave him the slightest nod. "Ma'am," Jake said slowly, "I'm afraid there's been a complication with your demolition order." Karen's face went pale. "What kind of complication?" "Well," I said, stepping forward with a grin I couldn't suppress, "the complication is that you hired my company to demolish my own property." The look on Karen's face was worth every sleepless night, every violation notice, and every dollar in fines she'd extorted from me. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, and for the first time since I'd met her, she was completely speechless. "You see," I continued, pulling out my own manila folder, "Rodriguez Demolition Services acquired Apex Demolition 6 months ago. So when you hired us to tear down my barn, you were essentially paying me to destroy my own property." That's impossible," she sputtered. "I researched the company. I spoke to the owner personally." "You spoke to Frank Morrison, the former owner," I explained. "He's been forwarding calls to me since the sale went through." Every conversation you thought you were having with Apex was actually with me. Jake was trying hard not to laugh as he climbed back into his bulldozer. Should we pack up the equipment, boss? Actually, I said, never taking my eyes off Karen's increasingly red face, I think we should stick around. Mrs. Pemberton might want to discuss that demolition contract she signed. Karen's eyes went wide. What about the contract? I opened my folder and pulled out a thick document. The contract you signed authorizes Apex Demolition, which is now Rodriguez Demolition, to perform emergency demolition services on any structures deemed unsafe by our certified inspector. So, I said, pointing toward her house. Our inspector identified several structures in Meadowbrook Estates that pose immediate safety hazards to the community. Miguel chose that moment to emerge from his car, which had been parked across the street. He was carrying a video camera and wearing his press credentials from the Houston Chronicle. Mrs. Pemberton, he called out, Miguel Rodriguez, Houston Chronicle. I'd like to ask you a few questions about the financial irregularities in the Meadowbrook Estates, HOA budget. If Karen had been pale before, she was now the color of copy paper. Her head swiveled between me, Miguel, and the bulldozers like she was watching the world's most terrifying tennis match. I don't know what you're talking about, she managed to whisper. Miguel consulted his notepad. We have documentation showing that HOA funds were used to pay for personal vacations, expensive dinners, and property investments. Would you like to comment on the $47,000 in unexplained expenditures over the past 18 months? Those are legitimate business expenses. Business expenses like the romantic weekend in Dallas that you charged to the HOA account? Miguel pressed. The same weekend your husband was supposedly at a construction conference in Austin? Karen's face went from pale to bright red in the space of a heartbeat. How did you? She caught herself, but it was too late. Miguel had gotten the reaction he needed, and his camera had captured every second of it. Mrs. Pemberton, I said, stepping closer, it seems to me that you have two choices. You can continue this harassment campaign and deal with the criminal investigation that's about to destroy your life, or you can withdraw all violations against my property and dissolve the fraudulent HOA agreement that you used to steal my truck and terrorize me for the past 6 months. For a moment, I thought she might actually fight. Her hands clenched into fists, her jaw tightened, and I could practically see the wheels turning as she calculated whether she could still salvage her scheme. Then Jake fired up his bulldozer, and the sound of that massive diesel engine seemed to knock the fight right out of her. Fine, she said through gritted teeth. I'll withdraw the violation. All of them, I pressed, including the fines, the truck repossession, and the demolition order. And I want my property deed cleaned up permanently. Fine. And Mrs. Pemberton? I added as she turned to walk away. If I receive so much as a parking ticket on my own property, Miguel's article about HOA corruption goes to print the next day. She climbed into her Escalade without another word and peeled out of my driveway, leaving rubber marks on the gravel and a cloud of dust that took 10 minutes to settle. Miguel lowered his camera and grinned at me. Think she'll keep her word? Honestly, I don't care, I said. Because that contract she signed is real, and if she tries anything else, those bulldozers are going to pay a visit to her house next. Jake shut off his engine and climbed down from the cab, shaking his head with amazement. Boss, in 20 years of demolition work, I've never seen anything like that. You sure you weren't a lawyer in a previous life? Nah, I said, looking up at my great-grandfather's barn, still standing proud and solid against the morning sky. Just a guy who doesn't like bullies. The aftermath was even more satisfying than the confrontation itself. By Thursday, Miguel's article about HOA corruption in Meadowbrook Estates was front-page news in 3 different newspapers. The headline read, Suburban HOA, Scam Costs, homeowners thousands in illegal fees and fraudulent contracts. The article detailed everything: the forged property agreement, the systematic harassment of non-HOA residents, the embezzlement scheme, and yes, the affair that had funded it all. Miguel had even managed to get copies of credit card receipts showing exactly how Robert Pemberton and Sarah Mitchell had spent homeowners' money on their romantic getaways. By Friday, the FBI had opened an investigation into mail fraud, racketeering, and embezzlement. The state attorney general's office announced they were reviewing HOA contracts throughout the county for similar fraudulent practices. By the following Monday, Karen and Robert Pemberton had both been arrested. But the best part came 2 weeks later when I got a knock on my door from a nervous-looking man in an expensive suit. "Mr. Rodriguez," he said, extending his hand, "I'm David Chen, representing the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. I'm here to personally apologize for the treatment you've received and to offer you compensation for your troubles." Apparently, the legitimate homeowners had discovered that they'd been paying inflated HOA fees for years while receiving minimal services. They'd fired the Pembertons, hired a real management company, and were now trying to clean up the mess. "We'd like to offer you $50,000 in compensation," Chen continued, "plus coverage of any legal fees you've incurred." I thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. $75,000, I countered, plus a written agreement that my property is permanently exempt from any and all HOA jurisdiction. "Done," he said without hesitation. That afternoon, I got my truck back. The tow yard owner, who'd apparently been threatened with legal action by Karen's lawyer, was so apologetic that he refused to accept payment for the storage fees. 3 months later, Karen Pemberton was sentenced to 2 years in federal prison for mail fraud and embezzlement. Robert got 3 years for his role in the scheme. Sarah Mitchell, who'd cooperated with investigators in exchange for a lighter sentence, got 18 months and was ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA. The forged property agreement was officially voided, and I received a formal letter from the county clerk's office confirming that my land had never been subject to any HOA restrictions. I used part of the settlement money to restore my great-grandfather's barn to its original condition, complete with a new coat of red paint and historically accurate hardware. It's never looked better. The most satisfying part of the whole ordeal wasn't the money or even seeing Karen in handcuffs. It was what happened with the Meadowbrook Estates community itself. Within a month of the arrests, I started getting visitors. Not the hostile clipboard-carrying kind, like Karen used to send, but actual neighbors who wanted to apologize and introduce themselves properly. The first was Margaret Chen, David's mother, who lived in the house closest to my property line. She was in her 70s, with silver hair and kind eyes that reminded me of my grandmother. "Mr. Rodriguez," she said, standing nervously at my front door with a homemade apple pie in her hands, "I owe you an enormous apology. I knew something wasn't right with those HOA fees, but I was too scared to speak up." Margaret explained how Karen had systematically intimidated anyone who questioned her decisions. Homeowners who asked about the budget were hit with frivolous violation notices. Those who attended board meetings were subjected to public humiliation and personal attacks. "She made us feel like prisoners in our own homes," Margaret said, tears welling up in her eyes. "But watching you stand up to her, it gave the rest of us courage to finally fight back." Over the next few weeks, more neighbors came forward with their own stories. Frank Morrison, a veteran who lived 3 houses down, had been fined $2,000 for displaying an American flag that was supposedly too large for neighborhood standards. Susan Martinez, a single mother of 2, had been charged $500 per month in landscaping violation fees because she couldn't afford to replace her dying grass during a drought. The pattern was always the same. Karen would target anyone she perceived as weak or different, then use the HOA as a weapon to extract money and compliance. But the story that really got to me came from Jennifer Walsh, a young woman who lived alone in one of the smaller houses near the back of the subdivision. Jennifer was deaf, and she owned a service dog named Rex, a beautiful German Shepherd who helped her navigate the world. Karen had declared Rex a vicious breed and demanded his removal, despite his perfect training and legal status as a service animal. She filed complaint after complaint, Jennifer told me through her interpreter. She said Rex was too loud, too aggressive, too large for the neighborhood. She was trying to force me to choose between my home and my independence. The violation notices had escalated to threatened legal action before the FBI investigation derailed Karen's plans. Jennifer was still fighting panic attacks every time she saw an official-looking document in her mailbox. If you hadn't stopped her, Jennifer's interpreter continued, I would have lost everything. Rex isn't just my service dog, he's my lifeline. That's when I realized the true scope of Karen's evil. It wasn't just about money or power. She had been systematically targeting the most vulnerable members of her own community, using their fears and limitations against them. The new HOA board, led by David Chen, asked me to attend their first official meeting as an honored guest. The contrast with Karen's regime was striking. Instead of a sterile conference room designed to intimidate, they met in Margaret's living room, with homemade cookies and actual conversation. Mr. Rodriguez, David said, addressing the group of about 20 homeowners, we wanted you here tonight because your courage exposed a system of corruption that was destroying our community. We'd like to know if there's anything we can do to be better neighbors. I looked around the room at these people who had been living in fear of their own HOA, and I made a decision that surprised even me. Actually, I said, there is something. I'd like to offer free security services to anyone in the community who feels threatened or vulnerable. The room went quiet. Margaret was the first to speak. What kind of security services? Well, I explained, Rodriguez Demolition has contracts with several private security companies. We use them to protect construction sites and equipment. I was thinking we could extend that protection to anyone who needs it. Susan Martinez raised her hand tentatively. I've been getting strange phone calls since the news story came out. Someone keeps hanging up when I answer, but I can hear breathing on the other end. That's exactly what I'm talking about, I said. Nobody should feel unsafe in their own home. Within 2 weeks, I had security cameras installed around Jennifer's house and a direct line to local law enforcement for anyone experiencing harassment. Susan got a new security system and regular patrol checks during evening hours. Frank Morrison, who'd been receiving threatening letters from Karen's supporters, got a personal security consultation and emergency contact protocols. The funny thing was, providing these services actually helped my business. Word spread throughout the county about the contractor who protected his neighbors, and suddenly, everyone wanted to work with Rodriguez Demolition. We expanded from 4 employees to 12, and our reputation for integrity brought in contracts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. But the real satisfaction came 6 months later, when I was sitting on my front porch one evening and saw a familiar white Escalade driving slowly past my property. Karen had been released early for good behavior, and apparently, she'd moved back into her old house while her husband served out his sentence. She was driving past my ranch every few days, always slowing down when she got to my mailbox, that same weathered wooden post with a rusty metal box that had started this whole mess. The difference now was that she wasn't alone in her harassment. Several of Karen's old allies in the community had started their own petty revenge campaign, leaving nasty notes on cars and making anonymous complaints to the county about noise violations. That's when Margaret Chen called me with an interesting proposition. Tommy, she said over the phone, some of us have been talking, and we want to make you an honorary member of the new Meadowbrook Estates Community Association. Not the HOA we dissolved, that corrupt organization, but a real neighborhood group focused on helping each other. I appreciate the offer, Margaret, but my ranch isn't really part of your subdivision. That's exactly why we want you, she laughed. You're the neighbor who proved that standing up for what's right matters more than following arbitrary rules. The honorary membership came with an unexpected perk, a vote in community decisions that affected the area around my property. When a developer approached the neighborhood about building a gas station on the corner lot near my ranch, I was able to participate in the discussion and help guide the decision toward a small public park instead. The park, which opened last spring, features a walking trail that connects the subdivision to my property line. With my permission, they extended the trail onto my land, creating a beautiful loop around my pastures where families can walk their dogs and kids can learn about ranch life. Jennifer Walsh became a regular visitor, bringing Rex for training sessions in my open fields. Watching her confidence grow as she worked with her dog was worth more than any settlement money. You gave me back my community, she told me through her interpreter one afternoon. Before, I felt like I was fighting just to exist here. Now I feel like I belong. The partnership with Meadowbrook Estates led to something even bigger. Miguel's articles about HOA corruption had caught the attention of a victims' rights organization that specialized in helping people fight fraudulent homeowners associations. They asked me to serve as a consultant on cases involving property harassment and demolition threats. My unique combination of legal knowledge, construction expertise, and personal experience made me an effective advocate for people in situations similar to what I'd faced. Last week, I got an interesting phone call from a man named Pete Williams, who lives in a subdivision about 20 miles south of here. Mr. Rodriguez, he said, I heard about what happened with your HOA situation, and I was wondering if you might be able to help me. My HOA president is trying to force me to tear down my workshop, and I think she might be using some of the same tactics that woman used on you. I smiled as I looked out at my barn, my truck, and my rusty old mailbox. Pete, I said, why don't you come on over this weekend, and we'll talk about it. I have a feeling we might be able to help each other out. Pete's case turned out to be even more outrageous than mine had been. His HOA president, another suburban dictator named Brenda Hutchinson, was demanding that he tear down a workshop that had been on his property for 15 years, long before the subdivision was built around it. The pattern was identical: forged documents, escalating fines, and threats of forced demolition. But this time, we were ready for her. Miguel had perfected his investigation techniques, and I had learned exactly which pressure points would make a corrupt HOA president crack. Within 3 weeks, we had documented evidence of embezzlement, fraud, and harassment that made the Pemberton case look simple by comparison. Brenda Hutchinson is currently serving 4 years in federal prison, and her victims received a settlement worth $200,000. Pete kept his workshop and started his own consulting business, helping other property owners fight HOA harassment. The success stories kept multiplying. We helped a retired teacher save her garden from aesthetic compliance demolition. We exposed a scheme where an HOA board was forcing elderly residents to sell their homes at below-market prices to the board members' relatives. We even helped a military family fight a ridiculous violation notice for displaying their son's Purple Heart flag. But the case that really drove home how much our work mattered involved Maria Santos, a widow in her 60s who lived in a small house she'd owned for 30 years. A new HOA had formed around her property and immediately declared her house non-compliant with neighborhood standards. The harassment escalated to the point where they were threatening to foreclose on her home over $15,000 in supposedly unpaid fees. Maria was preparing to move in with her daughter and abandon the house where she'd raised 5 children. When we investigated the case, we discovered that the HOA had been formed specifically to target Maria's property for redevelopment. The board members were all investors who wanted to buy her lot cheap and build a strip mall. The look on Maria's face when we told her that her home was safe and that the predatory HOA would be dissolved was something I'll never forget. She cried for 10 minutes straight, then insisted on making us the biggest Mexican dinner I've ever eaten. "You saved my life," she told me, as we sat in her kitchen, surrounded by family photos spanning 3 generations. "This house isn't just where I live, it's where my family story lives." Because if there's one thing I learned from dealing with Karen Pemberton, it's this: bullies only understand one language. And sometimes, the best way to deal with an HOA Karen is to speak that language better than they do. My demolition company is doing better than ever, by the way. Word has gotten around about what happened with the Pembertons, and now half my business comes from people who want to hire the guy who outsmarted the HOA from hell. But the consulting work has become just as important to me. There's something deeply satisfying about helping people fight back against the system that tried to destroy my family's legacy. We've helped over 50 families in the past 2 years, and every single case has ended with the property owner keeping their home and the corrupt HOA being dissolved or reformed. The word is spreading, and now HOA attorneys think twice before taking on cases involving property harassment. The irony isn't lost on me that I started my demolition company to tear things down, but some of my most meaningful work involves helping people build their lives back up. But every now and then, when I'm out feeding my cattle in the evening and I hear the sound of expensive cars cruising slowly past my property, I just smile and wave. Because they can drive by all they want, but this ranch, this barn, this mailbox, this life that my family built isn't going anywhere. And if they want to try to take it again, well, I've got 3 bulldozers, a team of investigative journalists, and a whole lot of experience dealing with people who think they can push around the wrong guy. Karen Pemberton learned that lesson the hard way. The next HOA Karen who comes for my property or anyone else's is going to get a demolition story they'll never forget. Trust me on that.